U.S. household debt has hit a record. The numbers are quite astonishing. The average American now owes an average of $105,000 and $56 in debt. It's an astonishing number, although it's always very abstract. But given that we live in a world, an American world at least, where 1 in 4 U.S. households are living paycheck to paycheck, the two numbers don't quite equate. Everyone then is on extremely thin ice, but it's an abstract thin ice until it gets personalized, and that's what we're talking about today. Kristin Collier has a new book out. It's called What Debt Demands: Family Betrayal and Precarity in a Broken System. It's not just an economic analysis of debt, but it's the story of Kristin Collier's own debt, an astonishing story, actually. And she's joining us from Minneapolis in Minnesota, where she is a university professor. Before we get to the broader abstract understanding of U.S. debt, Kristin, I think we have to start with your own story. It's an astonishing story and a very chilling one.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm such a huge fan of the podcast and so happy to be here. And as you note, I'm in the book, What Debt Demands, I'm hoping to make this sort of abstract experience of debt concrete through my own experience. And so my experience is that senior year of college, I went to take out a credit card in hopes to kind of help fill some gaps in income until I could start my first job. And I learned after running a credit report at the bank that there was over $200,000 of fraudulent debts on my name that I didn't know about. So I had not consented to these debts. Most of them were private student loans. Some of them were credit cards. And then I found out soon after that it was my mother, who was a gambling addict, who had acquired these debts. And so I spent all of my 20s and most of my 30s trying to navigate these debts, trying to get out of them, talking to debt collectors, talking to lawyers, making payments, working multiple jobs, and trying to understand what had happened to me and how I could stop it.
Yeah, and I know in one of your pieces of writing, you note that April 2020 marked the first month since you graduated college 13 years earlier, where you didn't pay a portion of your wage towards your debt. But I have to ask this, Kristin, I'm sure everyone asks the same question when they hear your story. Wasn't this a case of criminal theft? Your mother, she might have been your mother, but she basically stole off you.
Yeah. And there was an option that I had where I could have pressed charges, and that was one pathway to relief that was available to me. It wasn't the pathway I wanted to take because I wanted to be protective of my mother, and I didn't think that serving time in prison would help to kind of heal our relationship. And that wasn't the pathway I wanted to take for relief. But I will say, even though this is an example of a particular kind of theft that is not common to most students, I do think it provided an entry point into understanding the broader system. Private student loans are always unequal, and they're very often predatory, whether a parent has done something, illicit like my mother did.
Your story appeared on the Daily Mail, a scandal sheet, a British scandal sheet. Your mother said, "It was me, honey. All of it was me." It must have been a terribly depressing and deeply emotional moment when you learned what happened, Kristin.
Yeah, I felt really overwhelmed and isolated. Obviously, there was an enormous interpersonal betrayal at the heart of what happened. But I also felt pretty soon after learning, apart from all the relational stuff I was navigating with my mom, I became acquainted with how corrupt the system was very quickly as I tried to explain to these debt collectors that this debt wasn't mine, and to try to find what kind of pathway that they could offer me to navigating that. And essentially what these loan collectors said was, too bad, you need to keep paying on them anyway. And so I was given no help or no pathway really to find relief through the loan system. And I think that's indicative of the kind of attitude they have to student borrowers more broadly.
And you talk about these debt collectors. Are they credit cards? Are they private debt collectors? Are they government debt collectors?
It was primarily credit card debt collectors and then private student loan collectors, yeah.
And I guess another option could have been to have declared bankruptcy, or wasn't that really an option for you?
Well, so it's very, very challenging to get out of student debt through the bankruptcy process. So at one point in time in our history, after the Higher Education Act was passed, student debts were treated like all other consumer debts. And so if you lived with an unpayable burden and it was making your life very hard, you could declare bankruptcy and get out of them. And then the bankruptcy codes were adjusted a bunch of other times. The most recent of which was in 2005, when student debt was basically made impossible to declare through the bankruptcy process. And so that would be both federal student debts and private student loan debts. And so now if someone wants to get out of bankruptcy, they have to meet this principle called the undue hardship principle. It's incredibly hard to meet. And so very few people are actually able to get out of their debts through bankruptcy.
It's a form of serfdom in a sense, Kristin, is it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think plenty of people are talking about it in that way as a kind of indentured servitude. You live with this debt and are having to make payments on it. For some people, their entire lives. I mean, the older borrowers are going into retirement and having their retirement, their Social Security payments essentially offset to pay for these federal student loans of loans they took out, when they were 20 years old.
There is a debt crisis, a broader debt crisis in the US too, alongside household debt and the debts of people like yourself. George Will recently wrote about a great nation being America, reduced to fanciful hoping because of its debt. Top economists have warned about a bankruptcy crisis ultimately in America because of its $38 trillion national debt. How is personal debt connected with the national debt, the $38 trillion national debt that probably is much larger now? It grows every second.
Yeah, that's actually something I just have to be honest, I don't know a lot about to what degree our personal debts are bound up in the larger national debt. I will say that student debt is a part of the broader affordability crisis that I think, was the buzzword this year in the elections and was on many ballots and was a part of many politicians' platforms. And I think it's just speaking to a broader sense of suffering and inability to care for oneself. And at one point, there were more robust government services to fill some of those gaps. And these days, we're having to debt finance so much of our lives.
Yeah, I meant it more in a cultural sense. If you have a government that's so to speak, indebted to debt, then it's not entirely surprising that individual Americans are also addicted to debt.
Yeah, that really makes me think of so at one point in time, just to take us back a little bit, one of the ways that we treated debtors in the early United States and also before we became the United States and we're still the colonies was through debtors' prisons. And eventually that was outlawed in 1831. And part of it was because with the emergence of the market economy, people were encouraged to take on debt. And so I think that reminds me that economically we're encouraged to take on debt to go to school or to purchase things that we need. It's seen as kind of participating, I think, in public life in the United States. But that's really ended up hurting so many of us.
Of course, that's true. I'm certainly not going to challenge that. And yet, on the other hand, Kristin, one of the things that distinguishes America from the rest of the world is that it is indeed easy to take out credit cards and run up debt and take risks. So entrepreneurs, for example, often, many of them fail and perhaps become bankrupt or their debt ruins their lives. But I've done this. When I had an internet startup in the 90s, you're able to do it because it's much easier to borrow money in the United States than it is in other countries. Obviously your story suggests that that's not entirely a good thing. But are there arguments to be made that a society which makes it easy to borrow money is a good society in the sense that it encourages entrepreneurship and innovation?
Well, I mean, I think certain kinds of debts and risk taking are rewarded. It sounds like in your experiences that has been true, and that's certainly true for some entrepreneurs. I think when we're having to take on debts to care for ourselves and to kind of meet our basic needs, and so I think for me that includes education debt. Although I think some people would argue that's not a right. To me, it feels like a right. That also feels true for things like having to pay for medical care when what we're doing is trying to care for ourselves and kind of survive and live meaningful autonomous lives. I don't think that kind of debt ultimately ends up being a very good thing, and that we should have services available so that we don't have to do that.
So is that the core of the book, that we need in America a stronger, more generous state that pays for education, that pays for medical care? I'm originally from the United Kingdom, and when I went to university in the UK, my fees were paid, and I even got a small stipend. That's changed now. I mean, are there places in the world, in your research, where education and healthcare are paid for?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The book is not really focused on healthcare, and so I don't know where to what
Well,
degree
okay,
that's
we're just
true
leaving
broadly.
education, where you, through your mother's dishonesty, ran up these terrible debts.
Yeah, I mean, France, I think, is an example, in Germany, and certainly even in countries where it's not free, it's definitely more affordable. So people are able to either take on minimal debts or to kind of work full time. And that was true in our history too. Following the Higher Education Act in the 1960s, education was so affordable that people could basically work 15 hours a week and full time in the summer and pay for it out of pocket. And now people, because education costs have ballooned so greatly, they'd have to work 52 hours a year, year round. And so there is sort of, I think, some global templates for what we might do, but we also could look to our own past for having a more generous welfare state.
$200,000 is a lot of money to run up. I mean, I know it was done in your name by your mother, but what college were you going to?
I was going to the University of Michigan, and at the time, I think it was about $8,000 a year, and so I think you're acknowledging the sort of gap in what college costs, and then what my mother was ultimately able to borrow. And part of that speaks to what I said before, just the predation of this industry. So at the time, my mother borrowed loans as a part of something called direct to consumer private loans. They happened around the time of the subprime mortgage crisis, and essentially what people could do is they could go to a bank and take up to $30,000 of loans. A school did not have to certify that. So my school wasn't involved in these loans being taken out at all. And then they were transferred directly to people's bank accounts. And they came with interest rates that were 10 or 12%. And so, many of my loans were for $30,000. And if I were to pay the whole loan, it would have been $100,000. And so, yeah, there was a huge gap between what I actually needed and then what I was given, or my mother was given in my name.
And could your mother take out loans in your name without your signature?
Yeah, I mean, she did. She had my social security number and a falsified signature and my birth date, and it was incredibly easy for people to get loans around that time.
I take your point on education in a sense, but I know in California, and I'm guessing the same is true in Minnesota, if you go to state colleges, community colleges, education is much more affordable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly more affordable than it is at private universities, and some state schools are more expensive than others. And so I think a lot of people go that route. But just to give you a sense, people who sort of are poor students across the country who go to public college and have Pell Grants, which is just sort of certifying their economic need, are more likely to take out loans than their non-Pell peers. And so even when people are pursuing the most affordable option possible, they often still times need student loans to kind of bridge the gap between what everything costs and what they have.
I just happily finished paying for two children to go to college, private college,
Congrats.
which is extremely expensive. I'm guessing, and I know this is one of the arguments in your book, that all this hits poor people much harder than middle and upper middle class people. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the wealthiest people in the country, if we're thinking about certainly billionaires, but multimillionaires, they're not taking out loans to go to college. And so what ends up happening is those of us who need to take out loans, and especially those of us who need to take out a lot of loans, are paying interest on those loans. And so that means that the cost of our education is more expensive than our peers who are not going to school. It's also harder to pay it back. And I think something else that's very true is that people very often leave school without a degree. So I think as of 2021, over 40 million borrowers had left school without a degree. And so that means they don't have access to the kind of jobs that would help them, at least somewhat pay these loans back. And so they're really suffering under these economic burdens.
Should this be, in your view, simply illegal? I mean, should the ability to, I mean, obviously what your mother did was illegal. That goes without saying. So we're not talking about that. But should it be illegal for lenders to charge 30% interest on loans for people to go to college? Is that one of the arguments you make in the book?
Well, I mean, what I'm making the argument in the book is that we should have free higher education at public universities. And so, if we were to have that, we could delete private lenders entirely and federal lenders too. So, it wouldn't be possible to charge those kind of interest rates. But in the absence of that possibility, I do think that, of course, having interest rates like that should not be allowed, and that there should be enough federal aid to kind of cover the cost of attendance for students so that they're not forced into the private marketplace where people are ultimately trying to make money. And so the way to make money is to charge a lot of interest rates.
But someone has to finance this, Kristin, and I'm sure you've heard these arguments. Why should you, for example, if you went to the University of Minnesota or for that matter, the University of Michigan, why should you get it for free when someone else either doesn't go to college and gets a job or chooses to go to a private college? Why should public education be free? If you choose to do it, you're choosing to take a certain route, you're investing in yourself, you're investing in your future. And there should be, some people would at least argue, a bill for that.
Yeah, I see your point, and I think many of the people who think of education that way are thinking education is a commodity, a sort of thing that they purchase that will help enable them to make more money down the road. And sometimes that turns out to be true, and sometimes not. But because I think of education as a right, I think of it as something that we should all have access to. And to your point about people who don't go to school, I'm all for offering up free access to trade schools as well. I don't think we have to limit these kind of public supports to just college. The other thing I would say is that there are certainly ways we could structure our tax system to fund this. And so, just to give you one idea, the College for All Act by Bernie Sanders and Pramila Jayapal, they wanted to eliminate tuition and fees at public universities for families making $125,000 and under. And that's about 80% of the population. And they could do this by putting a very small tax on stock trades and bonds. So we could just put the tiniest tax on the marketplace where people are making tons of money in order to robustly fund school for everyone. And then in terms of some people having already gone to college and paid for it, which you might have asked, but also is something that comes up a lot in conversations with people, I guess I would just say that I'm sorry that that happened to people, but also I don't think we should continue to invest in this unequal system just because it's been unequal in the past.
What's Biden's record on this? Biden, of course, made a big play on helping student loans. That was very controversial, may have been, some people would argue, one of the reasons why Trump eventually defeated Harris in the last election. Was he successful? What actually happened under Biden when it comes to student loans?
Yeah, so a lot of different things happened under Biden, and I think his sort of record is mixed because of that. And so, as you note, sort of the biggest action that he took was an executive action, and that would have been to cancel between $10,000 and $20,000 of student debt for borrowers with federal loans. And that effort, if it had gone through, would have left 20 million people debt free. And so, of course, there were detractors, but I think overall it was really wildly popular. However, that was blocked by the courts. The act that he used, the HEROES Act, they said that he had used it the incorrect way and that the action was essentially too bold and had too big of an impact on the economy. So that was shot down. Then he kind of pivoted and he introduced this repayment plan, this IDR plan, so income-driven repayment plan that was more generous than all the ones in the past. And so it lowered the monthly rate at which people paid or the monthly amount at which people paid pretty significantly. And then people would have had their debt forgiven at between 20 or 25 years, kind of depending on their situation. That has been held up by court injunctions. It is very unlikely that that plan is going to pass through under Trump. And so two of his biggest sort of legacy items have been stalled or blocked completely. That being said, he had really significant adjustments to the public service loan forgiveness plan, which is what our public service folks use. So if you're a teacher or you're a nurse or you work as an EMT, you can make 120 qualifying payments and then have your loans forgiven entirely. And so he made huge updates to that because the program had not been working before him, and billions of dollars were canceled because of that. Similarly, he made adjustments to the IDR program, the income driven repayment program, and billions of dollars were canceled under that. And finally, he made changes to the borrower's defense program, which is the avenue you take if you go to a private school that has defrauded you, and billions of dollars were canceled under that. So he ultimately got students a lot of relief, but his sort of biggest actions were overturned.
And I'm guessing that Trump himself has shown very little interest in student debt, although he's relatively popular with young people, and presumably there are many Trump voters who would like some sort of debt relief or forgiveness.
Yeah, I think student debt relief is by and large really popular, kind of across party lines. And President Trump,
I mean, it's obviously popular with students who own people who owe money, but is it popular with people who don't have debt, especially student debt?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was slightly over 50% of people polled, and I can't remember which organization did this poll. I'm trying to flip through my notes to find it, but we're interested in some kind of relief for students, either student debt cancellation or just sort of more generous repayment plans. So I think what people do recognize is that students are suffering for wanting to go to school. And I think there's a lot of kind of media that focuses on sort of like the consumption habits of young people and try to paint student debt relief as a kind of upper class issue. But actually, I don't think it's really felt that way by the broader population. And in terms of Trump and students, I mean, I think he is antagonistic to students and to the Department of Education. I mean, he's just gutted his Department of Education. He's absolutely uninterested in meaningfully supporting students at all. There was the Big Beautiful Bill that just passed, had some changes to student debt. And sort of the summary version of it is that student loan payments are going to get more expensive. There's going to be fewer pathways to relief. Students are going to pay for longer, and there's kind of there's new borrowing caps on Parent Plus loans and Graduate Plus loans that will make it harder for people to go to school and to go to graduate school if they don't already have family wealth.
There used to be a lot of news about debt activism. I know that there was a story from a couple of years ago about how debt activists brought $10 million in student debt for only $125,000 and canceled it all. Is there still a lot of debt activists? Have you got involved in that movement?
I have. So I'm a part of the Debt Collective, which was born out of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And it is an organization of a union of debtors from across the country. And so we're working together to get debts canceled, harmful debt, predatory debts canceled. And so that includes rental debt and student debt and healthcare debt. And then we're also working to kind of generously fund those services to stop debt from starting to begin with. And so that means fighting for higher education that's free, and for free healthcare, and for rent stabilized options for people, just housing that's accessible to everyone. And so that entails for us, lots of actions, showing up places and making ourselves heard. It means contacting representatives. Recently, the organization worked with some people to go on a rent strike. The Debt Collective was also behind a couple of the big borrower wins historically. So there was a bunch of people who were defrauded by Corinthian colleges in the early 2000s, and they helped organize with these students to band together and go on a debt strike, which ultimately ended with those students having their debts canceled entirely, along with everyone else who'd attended these colleges. And they developed this form that now has led to the borrower's defense program so that other people can get their debts canceled.
I'm guessing this is mostly a Democrat issue as opposed to a bipartisan one. You've already mentioned Bernie Sanders. Is this an issue that's being championed by any potential national candidates in 2028? Has AOC addressed it? Not that she's necessarily running. I'm guessing more of a centrist like Gavin Newsom is probably staying away from it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I should look into that. I don't know any potential presidential candidates, like I'm not sure what their platforms would be on it. I mean, I think more recently there's been so much thinking around sort of affordability as kind of a large scale issue that it hasn't seemed people have gotten into sort of more granular issues like student debt, sort of separating out the affordability agenda. But I imagine it will be an issue. And so one thing I think to think about is, so under the moratorium on student loan payments that happened during the pandemic, students weren't paying on student debts, and they were able to get the pause, and there was a pause in interest as well as a part of that. And then there was, after the SAVE program was launched, lots of students under SAVE also had their payments paused and their interest paused. And starting in August, student debt interest collection has started again, and payments restarted earlier than that. And so what that essentially means is people who are really suffering and unable to pay, that's going to start showing up on their credit report really soon. And so, and there's all kinds of ramifications for that, including the possibility for the federal student government to offset Social Security payments and to garnish their wages. And so I think very soon, especially in the next election, people are going to be talking about student debt a lot more as the suffering becomes more tangible.
Yeah, and of course, both parties, I guess, will come up with programs to try and mitigate it in one form or the other. What does it feel like? I mean, you obviously fell into this bizarre, dramatic debt through the dishonesty of your mother. But what does debt feel like? As I said, you, for 13 years, a portion of your wage was going towards a debt that you didn't even take out or knew nothing about. What does it feel like? Does it feel as if someone owns you, Chris?
It does. And I really appreciate that question because part of the project of the book for me was to try to articulate the experience of living with debt, what that feels like. It's both this sort of presence and absence all at once. And I interviewed a lot of other borrowers for the book too, and I wanted to hear them articulate how it felt to them. And so I will say that to me, having debt, I felt it in my body, just this enormous heaviness and
Mm.
dread. At different points in times, I talked about it as kind of like a haunting. I felt like sort of the ghosts of the debt were popping up all over the place. I mean, when I went to run my credit card at a grocery store, even though I understood logically that I knew I was able to use that, there was some voice in the back of my head that said it might get rejected. Or whenever I went to check my bank account online, I just felt myself sort of seize that I might get some kind of awful news that I couldn't care for myself. Or every time I got a new, unknown number on my phone, I assumed it was going to be a debt collector calling to demand payment that I didn't have. And so I felt like the forces of collection were kind of all around me and coming at me all the time.
Did it create, even though you were entirely innocent of all this, did it give you a sense of guilt then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think people historically have been told that to have debt, especially debt that you can't pay, is to be bad, that there's something immoral about being in debt. And so, even though I didn't make these choices, I did have this debt. And I think debt kind of creates and reinforces that feeling in all of us that we should be ashamed and that we have done something wrong. And that's a really common experience across borrowers. I talked to one borrower for this book, for example, about having debt, and I asked him if that had impacted sort of intimate relationships in his life with friends or family or potential partners. And he shared that he was scared to date people because he didn't want to have to share with someone else that he had all this debt. And even though he was proud to have gone to school, he was so deeply ashamed with how it harmed his life that he was kind of forgoing connection at all.
It's a kind of it's a similar phenomenon in some ways, I guess, to addiction, is it? To alcoholism or the feeling of being an alcoholic or an addict of some sort.
Yeah, I imagine that's true. And I also think what it has in common is this sort of maybe cultural sense that you as an individual are at fault. And so an addict has choice. Of course, they have free will, and so of course there's choice as a part of that, but it's also a response to like a disease and to kind of a broader public health landscape. And so I think the same is true for debt. So of course we have choices we get to make about the student debt that we take out. Of course, there might be borrowers who later on wish they had made decisions slightly differently. But regardless of that, it's a response to a broader crisis that is not any one individual's fault.
And I brought this stat up earlier, and this was from a headline earlier this month on CNN. If 1 in 4 US households are living paycheck to paycheck, and the average American consumer is carrying $105,000 in debt, aren't we on the verge of some sort of profound catastrophic economic meltdown?
It seems like it to me. I am not an economist, but it does seem like pretty soon people aren't going to be able to pay anything, and that's going to have all kinds of ramifications for our broader economy. And I think is a real testament to the fact that politicians need to take this seriously and address meaningful policies to bring real relief to people.
Although some politicians might say that because of the national debt, it's a problem that's very hard to address without perhaps some sort of national bankruptcy. I know it's a very personal story of your own relationship with your family. The subtitle of the book is Family Betrayal and Precarity in a Broken System. How did this experience change your relationship with your mother? And how did the writing of the book, did it make you forgive more? I know you've written that you only see your mother once or twice a year, so you're not close.
I think we're still wrestling with the debt today. It's stayed in, I mean, it was just recently that I got out of the private student loans. And I think we're both sort of haunted by what happened. I mean, my mother has a lot of shame about what happened. She's deeply sorry. And still, we're navigating how to heal collectively. I think um, yeah, I think it's something we're gonna be wrestling with the rest of our lives, but I will say that writing the book was really useful in understanding my mom's decisions within a kind of broader landscape. I've loved her and I still love her. I've loved her my entire life and I still love her, and I think that so much of what she's done has been really incredible and good for me, and this is kind of one decision among many. Unfortunately, it was a really enormous decision, and it's had really big ramifications for my life, but writing the book helped me to kind of understand all the ways that she was preyed upon too. She shouldn't have been able to take out these loans. There should have been checks. I mean, a credit report was drawn every single time she took out another loan. There were a total of 8 loans on my credit report. And so someone should have seen that something was wrong. And the private student lenders didn't care because they wanted to make this money. And so she was absolutely taken advantage of. And similarly, gambling addiction is not just a disease, but it's a response to a built environment in the casino in which people are preying upon addicts to make money. And so I understand she could have made decisions differently, but after doing all this research, I also can see what happened with a lot of compassion as well. And so I think it's not necessarily about forgiving or not, but just sort of understanding one another as sort of like the complicated people that we are. And that is, it's kind of own healing, I guess.
Yeah, and you've mentioned gambling, another source, of course, of massive debt, and it's becoming increasingly ubiquitous, particularly amongst young people and online gambling. So that must be another theme that you pursued in your research and in this book.
Yeah, I think a little bit about at the end. I mean, I think what was really hard is narrowing what kind of debts I wanted to consider as part of my investigation, because as you're noting, debt is everywhere. I mean, everywhere we turn in the US, there's some kind of form of debt, and often alongside that, some kind of form of predation. So I spent a little time about thinking of gambling and doing some research on it at the end of the book in order to understand my mother more completely. But I think it's something I'd like to maybe research more for another project.
It's interesting that you talk, Kristin, about how that makes one feel immoral, as if one's failed. I think that's a broader cultural assumption. I have to admit, before doing this interview, I thought, I wonder what Kristin Collier is going to be like, given that she owes all this money. You come across as incredibly positive and smart and successful. You're now a professor in Minneapolis. So could one make an argument, it's probably an unfair question, Kristin, that ultimately this has been, if not good for you, it's a form of character building, that you may have become a quite different person had your mother not saddled you with these hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt. And I'm not suggesting that that justifies it. I'm not suggesting that other parents should go out and indebt their kids. But is there anything positive about what you've experienced?
What's been positive is connecting with other borrowers. So through my work with the Debt Collective specifically, I've met hundreds of other people across the country with their own debt burdens, and learning about all the ways that our lives overlap and how interesting and strong all these people are has been really overwhelming. I mean, I feel really united with other debtors everywhere, and I think all of us are really interested in creating a better world for everyone else. And that feels great to know that that's true. I like to think I would have found my way to that community anyway. And as you acknowledge, I would never have chosen this particular way to learn these lessons about debt. I mean, it had absolutely fractured my relationship with myself and the world and my community, and for so long, my mother. And so I would have opted out of this particular lesson. But yeah, it's been really wonderful to connect with other borrowers.
What about just the straight anti-capitalism? I mean, you only have to go online or certainly go on television or radio, and you're bombarded with advertising everywhere you go. When you drive, billboards everywhere, there's advertising getting you to spend money, some of which you obviously don't have. Is there an anti-capitalist element to the argument, or are you suggesting perhaps that advertising is part of the problem, and if we could only get rid of advertising, it would stop people endlessly borrowing money?
I mean, I'm a democratic socialist, so I have lots of critiques of capitalism. I don't name that in the book explicitly. I think partially because I think people sort of seize up a little bit. They have ideas about what capitalism means and what socialism means. And as soon as those words are introduced, I think people kind of shut down. And so I wanted people to find their way into a capitalist critique without me announcing it as such. But absolutely, I think an economic system which is engineered to continue to take and take and take from people and driven by profit is not going to be ultimately very rewarding for us.
And finally, Kristin Collier, if there are candidates, 2028 presidential candidates watching this, I hope there are, maybe Gavin Newsom or somebody else, what would you like to see from them in terms of concretely and directly addressing this debt crisis?
Well, I hope Sean Fain, who I would love as president, is listening to this, president of the United Auto Workers. But I think debt cancellation, massive debt cancellation, presidents have that through the higher education, through authority given by the Higher Education Act, through their compromise and settle authority. And so I think massive cancellation. I think taking very seriously and pushing through to the degree they're able to this legislation around free higher education. And then I think pushing through bankruptcy protections again, so that student loans get the consumer protections. They're treated as a consumer item already, but they're not given the same protections for people who are suffering. So I think those are three pretty enormous places to start.
Yeah, I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, why should you be allowed to declare bankruptcy for borrowing to gamble or to buy expensive cars or other items you can't really afford, whereas you can't declare bankruptcy for borrowing for education? So that seems to me certainly a start that not just democratic socialists, but all political persuasions can afford. Well, congratulations, Kristin, not on your debt, but certainly on the book, What Debt Demands, Family Betrayal and Precarity in a Broken System. We live in a precarious system. That's the nature of American capitalism. I think it's an appropriate book. Perhaps one day, Kristin, you will run for office.